Welcome everybody. My name is Sergey Gavrilets. I'm a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology and also mathematics here at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And I'm also associated with two centers here, the Center for the Dynamics of Social Complexity and the National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis. And these are two centers that organize this series of webinars. And I have here these two web pages that I encourage you to take a look at, Nimbus and DISOC. And Nimbus has been around for like more, DISOC is much more recent, and we have a lot of interesting things going on. We also had a number of different activities related to the topics of this webinar on cultural and social evolution. And there are you can watch and papers that you can read, so please do it. And also this whole series is one of the outputs of a grant from John Templeton Foundation to promote research on cultural evolution and also promote Cultural Evolution Society. So kind of one of the things and which are at the core of this are teaching modules that were developed by several teams, and Paul Smaldino, today's speaker, is one of them. So here we have a schedule. There are 5 lectures by tutorial lead designers. There are also 2 lectures. One took place last week by Pete Richardson, and now one will be at the end by Patricia Izar. And these are people who were the members of the international committee that organized competition. And then we're also going to have 2 invited lectures by Peter Torshin and Ruth Mays, who run very successful research programs, but we're also founding editors of 2 very important journal dynamics and evolutionary human sciences. Before I introduce our speaker, Paul, I'll ask Eric Carr, who is our data engineer, to tell you a few words about how it works, the logistics of the webinar. Eric?
Welcome to the webinar today. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A feature for all attendees. You can submit your questions there, you can upvote them, you can comment on them, and at the end of the talk, Sergey will be moderating and asking those questions. I will be monitoring chat if you have any issues, but please do put your questions in the Q&A. Have a great talk.
Okay, yeah, and we also may have several of Eric, what's the status of panelists? And these are speakers of this series or people who were closely involved into the development of this program. And they will have a chance to ask directly and lead some discussions. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Paul Smaldino, who is a paradigmatically promiscuous scientist, and that's how he calls himself, and that's from his webpage. And if you look at his CV and what he's been doing in his life, you will definitely agree with that. He grew up in Long Island, New York, got his first degree in physics, and then he spent hanging around and doing very different and exciting things. He was a lab technician, audio engineer, movie production assistant, lead guitarist, high school math tutor, textbook copy editor, and psychiatric nurse aide. And then he decided to go back to school and got his degree in psychology. Remember, the first one was in physics, and then PhD in psychobiology. And when he did a couple of postdocs with very well-known and famous people, and again, it was Center for Advanced Modeling, it was Department of Anthropology, Department of Political Science, Department of Computer Science, the whole package. And since 2016, Paul's been at the University of UC Merced, where he was just recently promoted to associate professor in the departments of cognitive and information sciences. So it's very great to have you here, Paul. Take it over.
Hey, thanks, Sergey, and thanks everyone for coming. All right, let me see if I can. Oh, okay. Let's try this now. Okay, are you seeing my main slide?
Yes,
Yeah.
we are.
All right, great. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about teaching modeling and what I think of how that relates to a pedagogy of cultural evolution, which is, I think, very directly relevant to the theories of modules and tutorials that were so graciously and excellently funded by the Templeton Foundation and supported by Pete and Sergey and Nimbus and Dysoc. So thanks for having me, and I'm really glad I could be part of it. So the backdrop here is, I think social science is more important than ever. There are a lot of problems that we are facing in our times, and they are social problems, they are human problems. Right? So we need to know things like, how does information spread and misinformation? How do beliefs and opinions change? Um, what facilitates or impedes people working together toward common goals? How do norms emerge and change? And then I think this is the best way I could think of to phrase this: is now like then, and will it be again? So what are the kinds of trajectories that happen and that occur in social dynamics, right? Do things go toward equilibrium, or are they cyclical? The issue for studying these kinds of questions is that the social sciences are deeply siloed. Right, so researchers studying human behavior are siloed into many distinct disciplines, different methods, different theoretical frameworks, different perspectives. And I totally recognize that there are institutional benefits for breaking things up into different departments, but doing so also has problems, right? It limits the sorts of questions that researchers tend to ask and the approaches that they use to answer those questions. It also means that researchers often lack frameworks or tools for dealing with complex problems at multiple scales that involve sort of issues that multiple silos study from different angles. So it would be helpful to have a bridging framework to facilitate communication between researchers and to foment better research questions. Now, given the title of this whole series and who funded it, it's probably not a total shock that I'm going to propose that cultural evolution is potentially a unifying framework for understanding human behavior and social change. And I think there are a few good reasons for why this is the case. One is that it's inherently interdisciplinary, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec, right? The field of cultural evolution has developed as inherently, intrinsically cultural evolution, drawing from biology, anthropology, psychology, mathematics, all the social sciences and the human sciences and the biological sciences. And it has sort of done so independently to a large extent of the sort of historical traditions of the individual silos. Another thing is that by doing so, it incorporates multiple scales. So both organizational, so from the level of individual decision makers to the level of societies, as well as temporal. So from the millisecond level of an individual decision to the millennia timescale of how societies change over time. It's also rooted in formal theory, and I want to say a lot about that later. So what's cool about cultural evolution is that you can study cultural evolution and draw from all these disciplines. So it works really well for me, who I'm always terrible at picking one thing and sticking to it. I like to flit around a lot. And it's one of the things that I find really attractive about studying cultural evolution is that there are times when I'll say, oh, there's this work from anthropology, there's this work from sociology, economics, psychology, linguistics, philosophy, evolutionary ecology, epidemiology. All of these fields have important contributions to make to the study of cultural evolution. But also, you can work more solidly in one of these disciplines and still benefit from cultural evolution. Cultural evolutionary thinking it provides a set of core concepts, I think, about human behavior that I think can facilitate interaction between the disciplines. So it can sort of serve as a conduit between conversations in the different disciplines. Of course, cultural evolution isn't the only sort of amalgamate discipline. There are many others, sort of the field of complex systems, network science, cognitive science, which is my home department, and communication science. And I think all these things, these disciplines as well can draw from multiple sort of more traditional disciplines and also inform cultural evolution. I'll still argue that cultural evolution has a sort of advantage over the others because its approach is rooted with the goal of understanding humans in their proper context, which is culture. I want to talk about the approach to studying cultural evolution and related, which is that I'm going to talk about and that the tutorial I did is really about, which is formal theory. And I recently stumbled across this really great paper by the philosopher Jim Griesemer called Formalization and the Meaning of Theory in the Inexact Biological Sciences. So Griesemer draws this distinction between exact sciences, in which theories involve a direct mapping between measurable constructs and model predictions. So, for example, if you're a physicist and you have a model about, let's say, charge or force or acceleration, velocity, mass, right? These are things that are measurable very precisely, and the theories are about predictions of those measurable quantities. The inexact sciences are those where that's not the case, right? Where mapping between measures and theories are imprecise. And this creates a challenge for theory in the inexact sciences, and often a widespread preference for empirical models, so heuristic models, verbal models, rather than formal models sort of by example, by archetype, by prototype. Now, the social sciences are inexact. And so we have to grapple with that, and we have to accept that the theories that we're going to produce are often going to be qualitative more than quantitative, and that we have to focus a lot and think really hard about what we're measuring and what we're talking about and what the relationship is between what we can measure, what we want to measure, and what our theories sort of predict or talk about are. The thing is, those social systems are going to be modeled whether we like it or not. And I think we want to make sure that the people modeling them are social scientists, if not by training, then at least by inclination. And what I mean by that is, if you're working on social science, then you're a social scientist. And you should be beholden to the standards of a social scientist and know what the relevant literature is, et cetera. Right? I've definitely heard too many people say, well, I'm not really a social scientist. I'm not really a biologist. And I'm just working on this project. But I'd say if you're working on the project and the subject of study is behavior, then you're a behavioral scientist, right? I think we also want to avoid the problem that this XKCD that many of you will know illustrates, right? This sort of problem of physicists and computer scientists modeling systems that they don't necessarily understand and making a lot of sort of problematic assumptions. Now, I love physicists. I once sort of was a physicist, and a lot of really terrific models and methods have come from physics and computer science, so I am not putting down those fields at all. But I think it's inherently challenging to have interdisciplinary work where you have fields that are traditionally very quantitative, but don't have deep training in certain things like social behavior or psychology. And then you have those fields that do have deep training in those things, but don't have the methodological approach, right? So it's one of the important challenges for interdisciplinarity. I'd say even though we have this issue of the inexact sciences, formal models still get you a lot. One is a clear articulation of what is and isn't included in theory. So for example, when I did a Google image search for formal models, these 3 images are some of the first that came up because I forgot that most of the world doesn't use the word model in the way that I do. And so what I meant was something like a mathematical articulation of a complex system and not very good looking men in fancy dress. So I needed to be more clear in my articulation to Google. I think the formal analysis of assumptions really lets you probe the consequences that arise from them, right? We want to know what are we assuming and what are we not, and what necessarily follows from those assumptions. And you still get qualitative predictions very often, even if they're not quantitative. And here's the thing, what the formal model gives you that is much more difficult with a verbal model is clear scope. Now, scope is something that I was introduced to by from sociology. And some of the other sciences, social sciences, behavioral sciences, haven't thought as much about, although recently psychologists have started talking about constraints on generality, which is related, but not quite the same thing. So scope is basically just the need to articulate what are the constraints on when a theory holds or doesn't. When does it apply? When doesn't it? What kinds of conclusions can we draw on under certain assumptions and not others? And being clear about this is something that's much more easy to deal with when you have a formal model. Formal models also gives you mental models for understanding the dynamics of relevant complex adaptive systems. So really the only way we make sense of anything in the world is by analogy to other things. And if you go into a restaurant, right, you know that, well, remember when we could all go into restaurants, right? Some of you have still. You can go in, there's usually like a host that says, oh, how many are you? Okay, it'll just be a second. And then you follow them to a table and they hand you a menu and you look at it and you understand that you're going to sit down. You have, there are things that you can look at. You can order food off of it. The waiter is going to bring you food. It's going to bring you water. These are the things that you're going to do. What you're not going to do is go in the corner and urinate. You're not going to lay on the floor and take a nap. You're not going to bust out into song at the top of your lungs. Because that's not the kind of place you're in. That's not the kind of situation you're in. You have a mental model for what happens and doesn't happen in a restaurant and what kinds of things could happen and what kinds of things are unlikely to happen. And when we're talking about understanding complex social dynamics, we need to understand the kinds of things that tend to happen when social structures are organized in particular ways. And most people are really terrible at this, just sort of intuitively. And by studying formal models, we get sort of an arsenal of mental models that really can help us grapple with these. Finally, sort of going back to sort of a bridging concept, models can give us a common language for talking about complex adaptive social systems. What are models? Why should we use them? Lots of researchers use models. Most of you, if you're scientists, use models at some point. Models can be physical. Models can be not physical. Models can be abstract. Basically, how do we know if you're using a model? You ask yourself this question: am I studying directly the thing that I'm interested in? Is everything about my question covered in the thing that I'm studying? Or am I drawing inferences from the thing that I'm studying to the bigger question? And if the second is the case, then you're using some kind of model. All right, so I take this definition from the philosopher Michael Weisberg. This is a picture of a scale model of the San Francisco Bay. It's in Sausalito. You can still go look at it. And it was used by engineers in the 1950s and 60s to make decisions about whether or not to dam part of the bay, which is a very complicated question, but it would be very costly to just try it. So they built a model to sort of see what kinds of things would probably happen. Lots of scientists, behavioral and biomedical scientists, use animal models, sort of drawing inferences from what happens when they study the model or what's going on in the biology or the behavior or the cognition of some animal to other animals, including humans. Experiments are models, right? Unless you're, working for the marshmallow industry, most people don't really care how long a child can wait to eat a marshmallow. But you're interested in things like trust, willpower, patience, relationships to authority. And we develop paradigms that capture certain aspects of those things and we draw inferences from them. So the experiment is a model for the larger class of behaviors that we're interested in. And I think that these are all, it's much more of a continuity than a clear delineation between these other kinds of models and formal models, sort of mathematical or computational models. But they are kind of special, formal models. So a formal model is the simplified version of a system with a specification of parts and relationships between them. I really like this phrase. It comes from the biologist Jeremy Gunawardena. A model is a logical engine for turning assumptions into conclusions. And this is useful, right, because our intuitions about complex systems are often really bad. And so models can show us how assumptions lead to unexpected conclusions. How do we build a model, right? Let's say we want to understand the behavior of some system, right? We got to break it down. We have to first articulate that system in the model. And I think this is really the step that often gets glossed over, that a lot of people who aren't doing a lot of modeling don't understand. And it's a point that I really want to emphasize, because this is sort of the key. The programming and the mathematics are challenging, but once you have training, that they're pretty mechanical. The real issue and what makes modeling complicated is how to articulate a system in a way that answers the question. So you have to do what I think of as decomposition, to borrow a phrase from Herb Simon. So what are the parts of the system? What are the properties of those parts? What are the relationships between the parts? And how do those properties and relationships change? The parts might be individual people, they might be firms, they might be tribes, they might be cells, right? We might be interested in focusing on things like health indicators, age, sex, wealth, etc. But we have to think clearly about what properties we need to build into the model as part of our explanation and what we're going to ignore. How you decompose a system depends on the questions you're trying to answer. There's no single right way. And this is often really frustrating to a lot of people. Say, well, how do I model some system? Well, it depends what you're interested in. There's lots of ways to model a system. There's lots of ways to think about something. And the way you break down that system into parts isn't obvious, because a full decomposition, right, would be everything. It would be just the entire world, and you'd have to go down to the atomic level, or the level of quarks or strings or whatever, and include every single thing in the world, right? A model inherently, and all explanation inherently, leaves certain things out. And the real question is, what are you going to leave out and what are you going to keep in? So there's no one right way to do it for any system or any that you're interested in studying. It's the best decompositions, and therefore the best models, are those that capture essential elements for understanding some aspects about the system that answer the questions we're most interested in. That said, some canonical decompositions that sort of everyone knows and learns can be really helpful, and they can help drive theory forward by getting lots of people working on similar problems, and they can encourage communication and collaboration so that we know that what we're talking about when we talk to each other, and we can know that we're talking about the same thing. So I think we need formal models for a complete theory of human behavior. But there are some issues, right? One is that most social science students, the ones most interested in the kinds of social problems that I talked about at the beginning, often receive little to no training in modeling. So there are some exceptions. Economics has a pretty well-established history of training in modeling, and cognitive science, sort of more recently, has traditions of training in models, but there are some really important limitations to those modeling traditions. So models in economics are rarely dynamic. They're usually about computing equilibria. Models in cognitive science are usually about individual decision-making and cognitive processes, rarely population level. And they're almost entirely computational. Sometimes you see training in game theory or agent-based modeling, which are great, and I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. One issue I would say is that oftentimes this training is pretty atheoretical. It's sort of, here's a tool that you can use to build your theory without really talking a lot about what people previously have learned and how it relates to the kinds of questions that we're interested in. Now, social science isn't the whole of science that's interested in social behavior. There are lots of existing modeling pedagogies, and some of them are really useful, but in general, they're not designed with a cultural evolutionary framework in mind. So mostly they come from either biology or complexity science. So think of the Santa Fe Institute. These are both really great traditions, and I have learned a ton from them. The biological systems are really great, and I really encourage social scientists to engage with the literature, modeling literature from biology, particularly evolutionary ecology, at least in terms of the questions I'm interested in. But they're rarely geared toward cultural and social systems at the level of complexity that human cultures are made of. And then often models from complexity science are focused on sort of emergence, sort of a wow factor, look what we can get when we have a lot of interacting parts, and are often a little bit weak on theoretical motivations. Now, I'm painting all this with a very broad brush, and there are exceptions, and there's really exceptional work from all of these areas that don't have these constraints. But I'm sort of using I'm focusing a little bit more on the stereotypical view. So how do we do it? How do we develop a modeling tradition that gets at the issues that we're interested in from a cultural evolutionary framework? Well, cultural evolution itself has a really rich tradition of modeling, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, right, with people like Cavalli, Sforza, and Feldman, Boyd and Richardson, and they built up these models really based on models from population genetics. And so evolutionary modeling plays a really strong role in modeling in general and understanding cultural evolutionary processes. So maybe everyone just needs to learn evolutionary modeling, but not so fast. So here's Pete. He said he might not be able to join this week, but he's here in spirit. This is a quote from his talk last week. Evolution is not the synthetic principle, it is a synthetic principle. So we need to go beyond just evolutionary modeling to understand social processes. Right? Integrating the social sciences requires what I think of as a new kind of pedagogy in modeling. Now, the fact that evolution is not the synthetic principle is going to come to no surprise. It's no surprise to social scientists, economists, sociologists, and the like. But I still do think it's worth emphasizing this because a lot of cultural evolutionists, among whom I count myself, sometimes forget this with the kind of training that they get. So I'll talk a little bit about how this kind of pedagogy, I think of this kind of pedagogy and how it might emerge. So there's this gap that we need to bridge. And I think that the long run goal, at least for me, is in developing a core modeling pedagogy for understanding human social behavior. So there's a challenge, and one is that human behavior is so varied and idiosyncratic. It's just too varied and idiosyncratic to distill a core. Humans do all kinds of things, both individually and in groups. How could any one curriculum capture those essential aspects? And to some extent, that's a completely valid criticism, right? There's no one curriculum that's going to capture every aspect of human social behavior or every modeling tradition that's important to the kinds of questions we might want to ask. But I do think it's possible to focus on certain universal and central features of human existence to at least develop, like I said, a common language of core models and modeling frameworks that both give us understanding of these are the kinds of things that are really important, and so we all know how to talk about them in similar ways. And also it gives us shared modeling traditions so that we can take them in different directions collaboratively. Another challenge is that's I think more serious to this is a lack of deep mathematical training and computational training among social scientists and also humanities scholars. Now, this is changing. Computational social science as a sort of pseudo discipline is on the rise. I think that there's a lot of headway has already been made in terms of better training for social scientists in math and computing. I do think there's some limitations there in the way it's been. I think if we need to remember that formal theory is important, that explanation and not just data crunching are important. And so sometimes I worry a little bit about computational social science being overly focused on things like managing large data structures and machine learning and the like. And those things are all great, but formal theory as well is important for understanding and learning how to make sense of those data and to figure out what the important questions to ask are. But I still think there's a long way to go between the situation now and the kind of mathematical and computational training that we need among social scientists to really develop rich theories that are not just relegated to fringes of the social sciences, but are much more core. So in the short run, we'll focus on simple models that require minimal formal training so that people can understand the kinds of, like, the way that models work, the way that models decompose social systems into parts and relationships, and the kinds of insights that one can get from those models. And I'll focus on things like agent-based models, which require some programming, but often not a ton, and don't require necessarily a lot of deep mathematical training. So a lot of social scientists have minimal experience with things like dynamical systems, differential equations, linear algebra, which are really important for deep work in these areas. But as a sort of scaffold, computational models, agent-based models, simpler models, sort of help get you there and sort of understand the benefit. And so with that in mind, I developed this tutorial, Models of Social Dynamics, an introductory module, which is up on the DISOC website among all the other CES modules. And its aim was really to provide students with exposure to models, with the theoretical intuitions you get from models, with tools to read and understand models, and with pointers to learn more on their own. And, a really key driving philosophy behind this was to assume minimal math and programming training, and sort of assume training consistent with usual social science grad program entry requirements. Now, obviously, anyone can take this. You don't have to be a grad student or an academic at all. It's available to everything. All the modules have come with code. They come with, there are lectures, there are notes, and there are exercises for future directions. I'll say a brief note. So if you're going to do computational modeling, you have to program on a computer. There's no getting around that. You have to learn a little bit of programming. I think everyone doing any kind of science should know a little bit of programming at this point. There are a lot of possible ways I could have gone with those, but I decided to use NetLogo, which is, I think, has a lot of advantages for an introductory course. So NetLogo is free, it's open source, it's very widely used. It has lots of really great built-in features. It's got drag and drop features. It's easy to make visualizations and graphing and put in sliders for, real-time parameter value changes. It's was explicitly designed to be easy to learn. So it was built to be learnable by, a smart and motivated high school student. And so the writing looks kind of like pseudocode, and it's pretty easy to get going. I've taught modeling. I do a lot of my modeling in Java, and I've tried to teach Java to undergraduates, and it is just the worst. You spend way too much time figuring out, helping people learn how to code, and not enough time learning how the models work. And that's really what I wanted to focus on here. Now, NetLogo has some cons. It can be a little bit slow for complex models. The built-in features can be overly constraining if you're trying to do something pretty novel. And so some people don't like that reduced control. And so if you're going to go deep with modeling, you may want to learn a more complete language and use something like Java or Python or Julia. But NetLogo is a really great thing to play around with. I recommend everyone download NetLogo. Do it after this talk if you don't already have it, and play with it. It's so fun, and it has a library of tons of sample models. A lot of them have really cool visualizations. It's pretty fun. Okay, so the course. The course is divided into 7 lectures. Each unit has video. It's got, include the slides, notes, any code that I use, and exercises for independent study. So the first is an introduction. It introduces modeling more generally, and as well as a little bit of NetLogo. And the last lecture reviews the course and discusses directions for further study. Each of the other 5 units focuses on 1 or 2 models for what I think are key issues in the human social sciences. So I just want to walk through each one briefly, give a little bit of a preview of the course, and also talk about some of my own motivation for focusing on these topics. So we start with contagion. So obviously, this is a really important and salient topic for understanding the times that we're living through right now. Um, it's also a really good framework for understanding not just how diseases spread, but also how ideas, behaviors, and innovations spread. And people have understood this for a really long time. So I mentioned before, the history of modeling in cultural evolution really came out of population genetics. But in what I think of as like the first seminal work in modeling cultural evolution, which is Cavalli, Sforza, and Feldman's 1981 book, they say in around page 40, they note, well, while they focus on PopGen models, another biological model may offer a more satisfactory interpretation of the diffusion of innovations than those derived from PopGen. That model is that of an epidemic. Contagion models are really cool. They help us to understand how ideas, behaviors, and innovations spread as well as disease. And also, these dynamics, and I think this is especially important right now at the current moment we're in, these dynamics can be coupled because socially learned behaviors also affect disease infection. So I'll give a brief plug. I've generally avoided plugging my own work in this paper, but in this talk, but very recently I did this paper with Jamie Holland-Jones at Stanford on coupled dynamics of behavior and disease among antagonistic groups. And we get things that look an awful lot like the dynamics we're seeing right now in certain parts of the world. So in the course, it's a very brief introduction to contagion. So we study SI and SIS models, so that's susceptible, infected, and then with and without recovery, with mobile agents, and consider how things like the time course of adoption is dependent on the way that that thing is socially transmitted. After this, I move from contagion to opinions and polarization. So this is probably the least theoretically cohesive area in terms of the richness of its theories and traditions, but I think it's a really important topic to address. And there's a lot of work here for sort of model savvy social scientists. So I thought it was important because I think it's an emerging area of research. So polarization is a defining issue of our time. So many of you have seen figures like this. This is just the degree to which people in the US identifying as either Democrat or Republican are consistently sort of take the liberal position or the conservative position on policy issues. And even 25 years ago, there was a lot of mixing, right? You couldn't necessarily tell everything about a person in terms of their policy positions just by knowing they're a Republican or a Democrat. And now it's much more informative as issues has become much more tied to particular policy identities, and the parties have become much more polarized. So models help us and really force us to consider how individuals communicate and internalize those opinions and beliefs, as well as how the structure of social interactions shapes opinion change and polarization. So if we're interested in things like how opinions change, how polarization arises, and what we can do about it, modeling these kinds of systems is really valuable. Prior work suggests that the assumptions we make about these details matter a lot. So I won't show it, but a recent paper that I did with my grad student, Matt Turner, really examines just the kinds of assumptions that one might make in such a model and looks at how even various assumptions about, let's say, communication noise or network structure really changes the way opinions change. I also think this is a really cool area of study because it really blends social science like sociology and network science with individual science like cognitive science and psychology. So in the unit, right, we'll study some simple models of opinions with both positive and negative influence. So positive meaning your opinions become more similar to others who are similar to you, and negative influence meaning your opinions become more different from people who are different from you. We'll consider how the way that people are influenced by similar and different opinions shapes the emergence of distinct cultural communities, as well as the influence of simple network structures on social dynamics. Okay, the next unit is on cooperation, which is a pretty core topic in understanding social behavior. I think almost everyone in the audience knows that cooperation is a pretty key topic. I think that there are really good reasons why everything we do And everything that we are as humans is by virtue of our ability to cooperate with each other. I think the best example of this is, and I think this is the last quote I have in the talk, but there's this, I think there's so much that's been written on cooperation, but still I think my favorite thing is this passage at the beginning of Sarah Hrdy's book, Mothers and Others. This is sort of an abridged quote. Each year, 1.6 billion passengers fly to destinations around the world. Patiently, we line up to be checked and patted down by someone we've never seen before. We file on board an aluminum cylinder and cram our bodies into narrow seats, elbow to having some video issues apparently right at this very dramatic moment. I don't know why. Keep trying. We file aboard an aluminum cylinder and cram out our bodies into narrow seats, elbow to elbow, accommodating one another for as long as the flight takes. I cannot help from wondering what would happen if my fellow passengers suddenly morphed into another species of ape. What would happen if I were traveling with a plane load of chimpanzees? Any one of us would be lucky to disembark with all 10 fingers and toes still attached, with the baby still breathing and unmaimed. Bloody earlobes and other appendages would litter the aisles. So cooperation is providing mutual benefit at a personal cost. And this is the bedrock of human behavior. So understanding the conditions for how cooperation arises and stabilizes and also fails is an essential task for a science of human behavior. Hopefully people can hear me. This seems to be an issue.
Yes, Paul, you're cutting out a little bit, but you're coming through.
Okay, cool. All right. So modeling also provides an opportunity to consider how behaviors and patterns of interaction co-evolve. So in the unit on cooperation, we'll study cooperation and reciprocity using frameworks of Prisoner's Dilemma, the Prisoner's Dilemma game, and evolutionary game theory. And we'll consider how things like assortment among behavioral types influences the evolution of cooperative strategies, as well as why a savvy reciprocating strategy, so tit for tat for those who know, can evolve where naive cooperators cannot. In the next unit, we'll talk about coordination and norms. So this is hugely important, and it's honestly, I think because I didn't originally come from the social sciences when I did my undergrad, I take a position that this is non-obvious. It certainly wasn't obvious to me how important norms were when I was sort of just starting out getting interested in human behavior. But I've really come to appreciate the point, which is well known among social scientists, that norms and not rational calculations of optimal outcomes guide much of our behavior in social settings. So norms are often arbitrary, but they're also they're not just useless. They're really important. They're what allow communities to coordinate and therefore cooperate more effectively. So some norms are obviously better than others. But this is really annoying. And I'll just keep going. Some norms are obviously better than others, but setting current norms may resist. So we might want to ask how norms change in these kinds of settings. And a related question is, how do diverse populations signal their norms to potential partners? This is a question that I'm extremely interested in, just more generally, and I think it's very much related to these kinds of models and these kinds of ideas. So in the unit, we'll study the evolution of norms using the framework of a coordination game, consider how group beneficial norms can spread or fail to spread when they're rare, and how interactions between groups that are largely separate can facilitate the spread of group beneficial norms. All right, the final unit is on cycles. I felt for me, it was really, really important to include this as a unit. Because many social phenomena that we're interested in don't settle to an equilibrium, but are cyclical. So understanding the dynamics of causally coupled quantities is really important for understanding social processes. So there's lots and lots and lots of examples. They range from predator-prey dynamics to the dynamics of political instability and the rise and fall of empires. So this is a figure that is probably well known to many of you, particularly any ecologists in the audience, right? This is data from the Hudson's Bay Company from the mid 1800s to the early 1900s of populations in Canada of snowshoe hare and lynx. And you see two things. One is that the populations of each of these species is cyclical. It oscillates between many individuals and few individuals year to year, and also that they're coupled together. And models like the Lacca-Volterra model have helped us understand how these kinds of dynamics emerge. Also, more recently, people like Peter Turchin have pointed out that a lot of political dynamics are cyclical. So this is cycles of violence in the last couple hundred years in the US. So in the unit, right, I wanted to study cyclical dynamics, and the first part of the unit focuses on an extremely simple model, which is the ecological host parasite model that generates very complicated and non-intuitive dynamics. I think it's one of the coolest models because of how interesting the behavior is from something so simple. And then we'll use that as a springboard to a much more complex model, which is Peter Turchin's meta-ethnic frontier model of how empires rise and fall. And consider how something that spreads rapidly when it's rare, but becomes weakened by its own growth, provides the foundation for all kinds of cyclical dynamics. And in the unit, we'll consider how factors that limit growth can benefit an organism or society in the long run. All right, I'm getting toward the end. Where do we go from here? The overarching goal, at least for me, is to create better integration among the social sciences, the human sciences, the sciences that study human beings, at least partially. What is not the goal is getting rid of separate disciplines. Right? I think that disciplines are useful for a lot of reasons, not only organizational, but there are, I think, tangible benefits from having sort of separate epistemic communities. And in fact, there's a lot of both experimental and modeling work that has shown this to be the case. But we also need communication between these disciplines. All the models suggest that some communication is optimal. And I will argue again that cultural evolution provides a framework for talking to each other. In addition to that, I think we need a set of core models from which to develop theories of human behavior. And I'm definitely not saying that the models that I proposed or talked about or focus on in the module are the models. But I do think that centering this core around universal features of human existence, so things like cooperation, coordination, communication, seems like a reasonable approach. So moving forward more narrowly, I think the first thing that you could do is go through all of the modules on the Cultural Evolution website that myself and others who are talking in this series have put together. Right? There's a lot of really great stuff in these, and you can learn a lot about cultural evolution and about modeling as well. The course that I've done is 7 lectures. It's very abridged. At UC Merced, I do a full semester 30 lecture course called Modeling Social Behavior. I am working on translating that course into a book, so hopefully that'll be coming soonish, and I will keep people posted on that. All right, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. That was a great talk. So as we transition now into questions and answers, Sergey is having some issues, so I will be taking on the role as moderator. And looking at the questions and answers, the one that has risen to the top, of course, is, Paul, do you have any related material in R? Something you didn't mention in your talk. And I'll also use that question as a segue to ask, people were talking about Python and how easy NetLogo is, but there was also a question about what math social scientists need to learn. So if they have to learn programming and math and everything else, how do you fit that sort of into the curriculum for social scientists?
Man, these are all really good questions. I'll tackle the easy ones first, which are, I think, the questions about programming languages. I don't have any related materials in R, except maybe a smattering of scattered things that I've taken from other people. Adrian Bell, who I think is talking in this series, has I think all his materials are in R on his course. There are lots of sort of simple models of cultural evolution. I believe also last I checked, Alex Masudi has a resource of simple agent-based models of cultural evolution in R. There are a lot of things available for that. Python, you know, it's Python is awesome. I really like it, and it's more and more being used for agent-based modeling. I don't have any particular resources that I use enough to recommend, but the sort of long-term goal after I sort of finish the book in NetLogo is to sort of redo all the models in Python, because I think that that's probably the most the modeling framework that's most flexible. As for the larger question of what math and computational skills that social scientists need to learn and how do you put this into an already busy curriculum? Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of conversations about that. I don't think that it's necessarily that hard, but it does take, I guess, being a stickler. You know, I think you can get away with offering sort of one or two courses that intro grad students have to take in modeling and just require them to have the requisite mathematical background to deal with it or to learn it. The best way to learn a mathematical or computational skill is to have a project or a problem that needs to be solved using it. I think that, you know, requiring students to have some mathematical background is not crazy. Now, there's this issue that comes up all the time, which is that not everyone can be great at everything. And if you require everyone to have all the skills, then you lose out on the people that are really kind of amazing and prodigious at certain things, but bad at other things. So you don't want to get rid of the person who's like an amazing ethnographer just because that person doesn't necessarily is not good at programming. And I think that's right. So figuring out how to deal with this in terms of sort of prerequisites, my inclination is to be pretty flexible. That said, I think that making theory core as part of disciplinary training and making that and understanding that knowing theory is really valuable helps us, you know, sort of show that there can be specializations, and you don't necessarily individually have to be great at everything, but you have to know what the specialization is. You have to know what a model is and how it works so that you can see its value and you can work with modelers if you're not a modeler yourself. I think there's a lot of possible ways, and I don't think I necessarily have the right way or the one way to do a pedagogy of modeling, certainly not at this point.
Okay, so let's open up a question or comment from the panelists. Does any of the panelists want to jump in? Andrea, you're still muted.
Andy, you're on mute.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Paul. Yeah, great talk. As you know, next week I'm going to be talking about animal culture, animal cultures, and you mentioned a bit about animal culture, and I think several of the elements you've talked about would be relevant in animal culture studies. I mean, contagion, cooperation, norms to an extent, maybe even cycles. On contagion, I was wondering, it's become more common to deal with the problem we often have of, establishing, is this social learning, is this cultural transmission going on, particularly in wild animals, where you can't necessarily do experiments like with whales. That Will Hoppett's methods of network-based diffusion analysis has started to become quite useful and used in different contexts. For example, with chimpanzees, with whales, you perhaps know some of that work. So there, the social network is established, and what you're really trying to see is, does the contagion spread over the social network, which is what you'd expect, what you'd predict if social learning's happening. I wasn't sure if that's become of use in human studies. I mean, I know it mainly from the animal cultures world. Is that familiar to you? Would
Yeah.
it be relevant in that unit?
Uh, yeah. So the impression I get is a lot of the social network stuff and that you're talking about in animals is similar to work methods that have been developed in humans. And I think one of the things that's really cool about network science and network studies is there's a similar fluidity of going from different systems to find out where they're relevant, and people who are sort of experts in network science and network analysis have been able to jump around to different study systems and import the methods from place to place. And I mean, I focused on humans because I think that's just sort of what I'm most interested in, but um I am familiar with some of the animal stuff, and like I said, I love reading and going to talks about animal behavior, especially of these kinds of things. I mean, um, Lucy Applin and Damien Farine and I wrote a paper a couple years ago about exactly what you're talking about, using models to
Yeah.
understand patterns in social transmission in animals. So, um, yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly relevance.
Thanks.
So, Paul, what do you think about the methods and tools developed in physics? There's a field of social physics, and there are also statistical physics and network theory, which seems quite appropriate to apply to some of the things you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I mean, I tried to sort of get at that a little bit at the beginning, but yeah, I mean, a lot of the modeling frameworks that I'm interested in, came out of social physics, like Ising models and some even the first sort of conformity models and opinion dynamics models came out of physics. And like I said, they're great. I've read a ton of these models and learned a lot from these models, but I do think that there's a certain point at which you have to stop just playing around with assumptions for sort of as recreational mathematics and really try to get bore down deep into the details of human behavior and human existence. And I think that having sort of richer social science training, or at least inclination for that, is really valuable. So I definitely don't want to discount that at all. A lot of the best modeling frameworks and work in studying how these models work comes out of those kinds of communities. Um, I just saw a thing in the chat from Sage Gibbons. I had a pop filter and it broke, so I'm sorry for any pops or hisses.
So one of the other questions that sort of came up with was um, uh, they had a problem with sort of the definition of cultural evolution and how it is how it is defined exactly. So the example he gave was a human invented a ball, and the ball was used to be played with, and from it was created games, and now we have Neyland Stadium at UT that seats 110,000 people. Is that cultural evolution?
uh, you know, there's a lot of details in there that are missing, but um, yeah, I mean, I I guess I used to be much more interested in the particulars of like how exactly is cultural defined and how exactly is cultural evolution defined, and I guess I don't care as much anymore. Um, we learn from each other, we build on things that come before us, and culture is just the milieu in which we live. It's sort of, there is no culture that is separate from people, and there is no people that are separate from culture. Um, I think culture is just what happens when people get together in a prolonged, live together for long enough or exist together for long enough. And individuals learn and change in their lifespan, and cultures and the kinds of things that are available for people to learn and to do change. And all of that, I think, is part of cultural evolution.
So this is a little bit more detailed question. Hamilton's rule plays a core role in explaining cooperation in microbes. In human social evolution, many of the models developed were made by Nowak, which has a strong opinion against inclusive fitness. Why do you think Hamilton's rule, inclusive fitness, being so little used in the field of cultural evolution?
I don't actually think it is so little used in the field of cultural evolution. I think people like Martin Novak have a thing with it, but I mean, those papers just don't make any sense to me. Into like, um, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I think there's a few different things. I don't need to get into a debate about, the definition of inclusive fitness and the use of it in models of cultural evolution. Although certainly in the book version, I do derive a sort of general case of Hamilton's rule. The thing about Hamilton's rule is that while sort of non-human animal biologists focus on the role or its relationship to genetic relatedness, it's way more general than that. And really, it's about assortment. It's about non-random assortment among phenotypes. And I think once you realize that, then it's extremely relevant to human behavior, about how individuals who are necessarily cooperative and maybe got that cooperation from common cultural descent are more likely to interact than at random. And in those cases, then you can take a Hamilton's role approach.
So a very nimbus question, since we're all about working interdisciplinary. One person asked, can't you just work with a math whiz? I could add computer science whiz. And another person commented, so what are your thoughts on working in teams and a subunit of how to put those teams together in these fields that touch on so many different areas?
Yeah, I love this question. I just published a paper which is called how to translate a verbal theory into a formal model, which is maybe a little bit overly ambitiously titled, but and I talk about that exactly this question. Although I will say that a lot of my answer is going to be stolen from the biologist John Wilkins, so props to him. I think on the one hand, absolutely, like I said, specialization and division of labor is sort of what human culture is all about, and working to our strengths and figuring out how we could benefit from each other is definitely the way to go. That said, a modeler, like anybody, is not just a technician, right? They are scientists, and they are looking to probe, deep questions about reality, just like all of us are. And so, yes, absolutely, get a modeler on your team. Get a person who does phylogenetics. Get a person who does behavioral experiments. Work together and build up rich theories from all these different perspectives. 100%. But you also have to know what each other are doing, right? You still have to know what it means when the phylogeneticist comes in with their, PCR analysis. You have to know. That's showing my own ignorance, probably, but you have to know what the why the different behavioral measures work the way they do and how they get the questions. And you have to know, if you're not the modeler, how the model works, what all the assumptions are, what all the parameters mean and how they work together, because otherwise you don't know, because otherwise it's just like, oh, I've got this idea here, modeler, go prove it with math. That's not the way it works, right? The model is doing work. It's not just proving what you already knew. It's showing you new things, and you have to understand it well enough to see how you have to understand the model well enough to get information from it and see what the model is telling you. I think that's true of all specialties. So yes, 100% teams working together, but also everyone has to understand what each other are doing.
Great. Are there any other comments or questions from the panelists? Okay, one of the questions in the Q&A that got a lot of response was about questions about the inexactness of social science, and some people point out there were some models available to do that, but they're often difficult. Do you have any comments related to how hard it is to apply good formal theory frameworks to social science?
I mean, yeah. Can you read off something
The
like what?
exact question was, are social sciences inexact just by definition, or just because there is arguably no good formal theory framework available yet to put it to the same level of exact science? And then Patricio said there are theoretical frameworks. They are just harder to map with empirical data because and things like that, and measurement error. So
Yeah, I think Patricia is absolutely right. So yeah, there's tons of formal theory in social science, although I'll say never enough. But um, I think what makes the social sciences inexact are not that there aren't models. It's that the kinds of questions we're often interested in, like inequality, cooperation, coordination, information, opinions, beliefs, analogies. These are things that are very hard. Identity. These are things that are very difficult to pin down and say, I have an exact measure of this, and it is clearly the measure, and we should all use this measure, and this measure perfectly captures this concept that we're interested in. That's extremely rare. It's not completely absent, right? There might be like wealth is, if that's what you're interested in, GDP. These are things that, like, if you're really trying to predict GDP and all you care about is GDP and you care about it for in itself and not as a measure of economic prosperity or well-being or anything like that, then fine. But if you do care about those things, you care about prosperity and happiness and identity and inequality, then the measures you have are always flawed. And we know this, right? And we know this is sort of a constant issue with social science. And we sort of do the best we can. And there's always sort of more nuance to unpack. And there's this constant push and pull between saying, well, but wait, there's more nuance, and also say, but if we only care about nuance, then we're never going to get anywhere. So we have to operationalize it some way and just deal with that for a while. And I think that both of these points are correct. So it's very difficult to have any sort of formal theory that tells you exactly what's going to happen, because the concepts we're interested in are very difficult to measure precisely in a way that everyone agrees on. And I think that that's just fundamentally a limit. But I still think you still get pretty far. And actually, models do work in this way too, right? Because what models can do is to say, well, when I'm talking about this thing like cooperation or inequality, I mean it like this. And I mean it like this relationship among people that do this or individuals that do this. And therefore, if we define it this way, then this will happen. And someone could say, well, but this other thing happens. And say, well, that's not the way I've defined it. And you might say, well, then the way you've defined it is stupid because nobody does that. And then that's also a conversation to be had. And then we have to build a better model, right? But the models sort of lay out exactly all of this. So I quoted Jeremy Gunnar-Wardina. He has this great paper that I stole a line from, which is, I think it's called something like Models, a Realistic View of Our Limited Thinking, or something like that.
So I think we have one last question. I have a question for Paul about complexity theory and computational social science as an alternative educational or methodological strategy to evolutionary theory and modeling to understand cultural evolution. Complexity theory focuses on nonlinear systems with emergent properties, complex adaptive systems, adapt at near chaos continuations. Are human societies such a phenomena? In other words, are most social process phenomena emergent? Regardless, couldn't social phenomena, emergent or otherwise, be better understood through a reductionist study of individual motivational, especially if individual motivation for cooperation is the bedrock of human behavior?
Well, that's two different questions. And I think that, I mean, it may not be written as two different questions, but in my head, those are two different questions. So let me tackle the first one, which is, yeah, I mean, complexity science it's awesome. I love it, and everyone should learn it, right? Like, I don't think of evolutionary science and complexity science as separate, really. I think of them as, if you're really going to understand evolution, you need to learn some things from complexity science. And if you really want to apply complexity science to understanding behavior, you got to learn some things about evolution. You know, all the stuff from complexity science, networks, attractors, emergence, dynamical systems, these are really important components of how to build formal frameworks and understanding of evolutionary systems and cultural systems. But you also need to know generally how these things change and evolve, and how the organisms and the cultural unit, you need to know some details as well. Right? You can't just be like, wow, complex systems are amazing, I can use them, you know, to understand everything. Well, yeah, but you still need to know some things about the specific systems you're interested in. Otherwise, you're just saying, you're talking about general properties of general systems. Once you have to narrow in on details, you got to learn some things about the real thing. Can you just learn about individual behavior? No, you can't. I mean, this is why siloing is such a problem with it. Like, you have people like in psychology and cognitive science who are only interested in what individuals are doing, and then you have people in social science departments that are only interested or mostly interested in how groups, you know, and societies behave, and they barely talk to each other. You know, individual behaviors come from somewhere, right? Individuals, you know, they're shaped by evolutionary, genetic evolution, which is the population process. They're affected by cultural evolution, even developmental processes, which seem like individual processes, right? The things that people are exposed to, the affordances that people have, the languages that people learn, you know, are all shaped by cultural evolution, are all shaped by cultural processes. So you can't understand individual behavior without understanding the social landscape and the sort of long-term trajectory of how that landscape came to be. And you can't understand the social landscape without understanding individuals' behaviors. So you can't do either, and just one. You got to do both.
Well, I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but I am going to ask one personal question at the end here. Are you in a band, and when is your first album coming out?
I was in a band that got sort of, you know, quasi shut down due to the pandemic. I was in a band about 10 years ago called the Small Dinosaurs, and our album is available on Spotify.
Great. So Small Dinosaurs, Spotify, you know, we really appreciate your talk, and we look forward to the next talks in the seminar series. Sergey, is there anything you want to say?
No, just sorry, Paul, I had to kind of turn off myself. Yeah, it was a great talk. Thank you very much, and I hope to see everybody.
Thanks. Okay. My pleasure.
Next with
and
yeah.
And everybody that's registered will receive a reminder for next week's talk. And maybe we can get some of these other people to answer some of the questions that weren't answered today. Thank you again, Paul. And here's where we'd be clapping and giving you all sorts of kudos. So have a great day.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
Everyone.
Thanks, everybody.